Hello, this is the first lesson for the jacket and skirt. In this lesson, what we're going to do is show you the pieces of the skirt. I'm going to cut it out, the skirt and the lining, and discuss marking. And the big finish is going to be sewing a balanced dart. So, let's get busy. Here are three of the body pieces on the skirt. To the left is the skirt back, to the right is the skirt front. These will be cut out of the wool. Then right next to it is the skirt pocket, which also will be cut from the wool. Now you see on these pattern pieces, and this is just something to really be aware of, is that if you're in a quandary wondering what seam allowance you're using for a certain thing, like the side seams or the hem allowance, it's all marked on the pattern, so you don't have to do any more research. These pieces will be cut from the wool initially. These three pieces are the waistband for the skirt. These will be cut from wool, but what I would say right now is in the initial cutting, do not cut these out. Save enough fabric so you can later, but do not cut these out in the initial go. These are the skirt lining pieces. On the left, we have the skirt front, which is cut on the center front fold. On the right, we have the skirt back, which is cut with the center back seam. So these are cut in lining. Keep enough extra for the lining so you can cut the waistbands as well, but don't cut any waistband pieces from the lining. We're going to cut the front and the back skirt, the front and the back skirt lining, and the skirt pocket. Those are going to be the initial cut. A little something to be aware of on the center front fold. In the pattern for the lining, there's an extra line right here, and I've had some students be confused and cut this out on the center fold so that the lining ends up too big. It is this line here where the arrows point to that is your center front fold line. And what I like to do is fold the paper back and then put that folded edge on the folded edge of the fabric when I'm laying this out. Here I have the lining pieces, front and back, laid out and pinned onto the fabric. Now, as you can see here, center front fold is on the fold of the fabric. And just some details to show you so you don't go astray. On this particular pattern, there are some stray lines. So this line here for the front hem, the cutting line, is the cutting line, not this one here. And a similar thing on the back. On the back, that one goes away. That's the one you keep. And on the side seam, the one outermost is the one that you're going to eliminate. The one closer in is the cutting line. And you see I have pinned everything in the seam allowances, because that way you don't risk leaving pin marks on the visible part of the lining. Also, you notice that I have the waists facing the same direction. It is not terribly crucial for a lining, but it's just something to talk about if you're working with the fabric with the surface sheen You want the pieces to face in the same direction, especially if it's on the outside, because the light will reflect slightly differently if you turn them top to bottom, which is called nesting. So we're all laid out, ready to cut. I'm going to be using the rotary cutter. You can use whatever scissors or cutting implements you choose, and we will cut out the lining. So here we have the two lining pieces cut out, ready for marking. Our next step is marking. You can see here that I've marked the darts and the stitching lines at the waist and the side seam on the center front lining panel. I've also marked where you turn up the hem. So as you can see here, I'm using tracing wheel, tracing carbon. If you have a tracing wheel that has rounded points rather than sharp points, this will be better because sharp points will damage satin. These will not pierce holes in the satin, actually. If you have a pointy tracing wheel, you might want to rethink that. So you can see here, I have one tracing carbon face sides together, one tracing carbon underneath the two fabrics face sides together, one tracing carbon on top, and the pattern itself. And as I said earlier, you have stitching lines that tell you what your seam allowances are. In this case, the side seams and the center back seam are 1 inch. Now, one other notch that I want you to make is you measure 9 inches down from the waist seam. This is going to be where you stop the stitch. You make a dot there, because when you sew the center back seam on your skirt, it's going to start sewing here and it will stop down here, so that your opening for your skirt is 9 inches. I like a longer skirt opening because I just think it helps you to get in and out much more gracefully. So I have my front and my back cut and marked, ready for sewing. Now I will progress to the front. When cutting your face fabric, you have a similar situation in the pattern as you did for the lining. So there are going to be two lines. The thing to know is this is the incorrect line. This line closer to the legend center front fold is the line that you will use to put onto the fold of the fabric when you're laying this out. One little hint when laying your fabric out. What I like to do is steam press, so it makes it a little easier if you divide up your wool into sections. So you can see here we have the pocket and you have the waistband. So if you reserve out one section for that and cut it right about here, it's much easier to steam press that fabric. I did the same thing with the skirt front and the skirt back. I cut one piece that had both of the sections in there. So it is much easier to steam press, but what I do recommend is steam press your fabric before you actually cut, just to make sure there's no shrinkage. Here I have the two front pieces, and I have the piece of the wool that I separated out to cut the front pieces, steamed and pressed. Now you're wondering probably, what are these marks on the fabric for? In a tweed, when both sides look pretty much the same, what I would recommend you do is decide which is the face and which is the reverse. We're cutting everything face sides together, so I put some chalk marks on the reverse. These will disappear when you steam, but that way it keeps you from getting confused. So be consistent, and then your garment will all look consistent in the end. On the skirt vent, there is one missing mark that we need to add before we actually cut and mark. So what I'm going to do is fold the paper up on the hemline. Like so. And if we come up to here, we're going to make a mark right there. I'm using my fingernail as a marking tool. And so when we unfold that, there is our mark. So yes, that, fold that together, see? That is where the vent is going to end on the skirt. So we want to have that mark transferred from here to the wool. So now, as you can see, I've laid out the top, or the front of the skirt. I'm going to lay out the back, and then we can cut. As you can see here, I have everything cut out, and there's one more notch that I want you to add to the center back on the face fabric. This is going to be the end of the zipper, and if you measure from the seam line down to 9 inches, you'll stop your zipper there. So we have this notch that we've added. We also have this vent that we've added. So we have these two pieces cut out. Next, I will cut out the pocket. Here is the piece of fabric that I prepared for the pocket and the waistband pieces. Now understand, don't cut the waistband out. We will be cutting the pocket out. So I'm going to show you how to refold the wool so that you can maximize your yield. What I've done here is to open up the strip and fold it here so the two pocket pieces come off of one end of this strip. So we have this piece here that we can use to make our waistband. Much more efficient use of fabric. I will cut this out and show you what I have after I'm finished. So here I have the pockets cut out, and you can see here I have the waistband pieces with the waistband fabric, which you will set aside, and we will cut that out later. Our next step is marking. This is a tool called an eyelet punch. It has a hole, as you can see, and you can punch holes in paper with it. So I'm going to poke a hole here and here, just through the paper, so that we can mark with tailor tacks. I also will punch holes here and here. This is a simple matter of putting some cardboard underneath and bearing down with just enough pressure to cut the little piece of paper out. So now we have little holes. We'll use these when we mark. You can see here I've punched holes at the tops of the darts and at the end points, and we will use those to mark our stitching lines. I've also poked a hole here at the end of the zipper and down here at the top of the vent. So we are ready to start marking. For the marking, I'm going to use Gutermann, and this is what's called Mara 30. You can use any other basting thread, preferably white, and I will use a fairly stout needle. And there are two different techniques. You're going to be learning first tailor tacks and then thread tracing. tailor tacks. What I'm going to do here is just barely catch the fabric. You want to go through both layers and then fold that aside, stitch it again, and one more time. And I try to make the loops pretty much the same size. It's not going to kill you if they're not exactly the same, but you can see we have loops now. And you cut your thread so that when you unpin the fabric and separate it, you're not catching your paper, and you pull and you clip. That's a classic tailor tack. So when you're marking points, this is the way you'll mark the points. Marking stitching lines is what's called thread tracing, and I will show you that next. We're going to be thread tracing the seam lines, the side seams on the skirt front and the skirt back, and the darts on the front. But before we actually do that, we want to fold the paper back along the stitching line. You do not want to catch the paper when you're thread tracing. So the folded edge, which is folded on the stitching line, that will be our guide for the next step. You thread your needle with a single strand of your basting thread, and it's a two-step process. You stitch once, and again in the same place, and you leave a loop. Then you stitch again, and you pull the second stitch flat. Second time you stitch in the same place. You leave a loop. So really, you stitch once, let the thread go flat. The second time, leaves a loop. And you just continue. Flat and a loop. This may seem like heavy going. I'm just going to finish this particular piece so you can see where I'm going. So again, you stitch, one goes flat, and then one is a loop. One is flat, one is a loop. One is flat, one is a loop, and flat. So now we have this sewn. I'm going to unpin here, and I'm going to show you what it will look like. It looks like this, with the loop every other stitch on the top. On the bottom, it looks like this. So now, when you separate everything out, you pull, and you cut down the center, So now, this is a little thing I like to tell you about. How to know the front side from the back side if your fabric looks the same from both sides. So you don't get confused. This side and this side look like stitching. But since you have whiskers, see the little whiskers? How I remember this is the face has the whiskers. So the side that has the whiskers is the face side of your fabric. So I will work ahead and come back here. This next technique is another method of marking darts. So I want accurate darts marked for the front. So I will show you this little method. You can see here I've made my tailor's tacks at all 3 points. So what I will do next is pull those through, and then with the scissors cut along one of the dart legs, just cutting through the paper, not through the fabric, obviously. And then fold the paper back along the stitching line, kind of like I did at the seam allowances. And again, sew my thread tracing. Now this, you noticed, I was able to sew 2 stitches in one pass. This is the advanced method of thread tracing. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So you take your stitch, this is going to be the stitch for the loop, then you can travel 1 stitch. Then there's a loop. So there are 2 ways of sewing the thread tracing. There's the one where you stitch twice, like I showed you earlier. And then there's this way, so if you feel a little more advanced, you can give that a try. Both are correct. Both will give you exactly the same result. So I am going to proceed off camera, and I will meet you back here when it's complete. And we're almost done. There we go. From here, now that you have all of the thread tracing done, you can push everything back underneath the fabric and then tape that closed. To preserve your pattern. Some people will sew these thread tracings and tailor tacks through the paper. I'm not a big fan of that because I like to keep the pattern fairly intact. So I will complete these other 2 and I will meet you back here. Okay, almost done. There we go. And again, take out the pins. Make sure everything is underneath the paper. And tape the paper closed. Okay, now let me show you what I have completed. So here we are. To the right, we have the linings cut out. We have all of the stitching lines and the dart lines marked. To the left, we have the skirt body, front and back, and the pocket cut out, and all of the stitching lines thread traced and tailor tacked. The bundle underneath is the waistband, which we will save for later. Now, looking at this, our next step is going to be sewing the darts on the skirt back. So now we are going to sew the darts. So this is what this back piece looks like. Here's all the thread tracing and the tailor tacks. So the first action is to separate everything. This is fairly simple. Pull everything apart and you cut down through. So as I say, the face has the whiskers. I will work around, separate these, and show you what I have. As I say, the face has the whiskers. So again, the face has the whiskers. I will work around the piece and separate everything, and I will bring it back here. Here is the back, and what I have done is I've worked ahead and I have split everything. So the next step is sewing the darts. I'm going to cut to a tutorial on sewing a balanced dart. This lesson is on how to sew a balanced dart. Looks like a dart from the front, but the key is here. We're adding another thickness on one side of the dart so that you have the same thickness as on this side, which is the dart return itself, so that when you look at it from this side, you have a completely flat surface. You don't have lots of bulk and no bulk, and you have a tip that just flattens. It doesn't make a bubble. That is our tutorial. So I have the wool here. I have made tailor tacks at the two top points and the end point of the dart. So to begin, because we have face sides together, we pull these and cut and cut, and the end point as well. So now a little memory trick that I always like to remember. The fabric is face sides together, and if you're dealing with a fabric that looks pretty much the same from both sides, the beauty of the tailor tack is that you can say that the face has the whiskers. So this here is the face of your fabric. Since this is the face of the fabric, we turn it over on the back so you can see we have the 3 points, and we can use these 3 points and chalk, or a chalk wheel, to mark our stitching lines. And I like to mark a little crosshatch here because I like to take the tailor tacks out before I sew. It's an easy thing to take the tailor tacks out. Turn this back over. So we'll put the right sides together and pin. When pinning, this is how I like to proceed. I fold the fabric so that the end of the dart is with the crosshatch. We know that is where the dart ends. And then there's what's called pin basting. So you can pin, zoom this in a little. You can pin through so that your pin comes out right on the stitching line. And some people ask me, is there a magic way of figuring out when both stitching lines are on the same pin? No, you just have to keep turning this over back and forth just to make sure that you have pinned accurately. Now, something to remember when you're pinning. This is called pin basting, and how I remember it is that the bulk of the fabric is facing down and the pins insert from right to left. Now, if you're left-handed, you would pin it upside down like so. The object being that when you go to the machine, you grab the head of the pin and the machine pulls the fabric off the pin. Now that we have the dart pinned, we're going to bring in a bias strip of the same fabric. This is about 2 inches wide. That'll be plenty good for most darts. So what we're going to do is lay this so that the stitching line is centered on the middle of this bias strip, and then we're going to repin. You can barely see the chalk mark, but it's midway between. Now, if it's not absolutely dead center, this is not going to kill you because we're going to trim this down later. But the object here is that we're going to be stitching through 3 layers of fabric: bias strip and the dart itself. Now, off to the machine. We're at the machine, and we put the foot down right on the stitching line. And we sew with the standard 2.5 stitch right on the stitching line. We're sewing through 3 layers, as I said. The garment folded back on itself and the bias strip. And as we get closer to the end of the dart, what I like to do, I just think it makes it more secure at the end of the dart, it eliminates the bubble, is to shorten the stitch down to, say, 1.0. So that when you get to the cross mark at the end, that's when the stitch will go off the edge and onto the bias strip. So we cut the thread. You can see it departs right about there. Next, pressing. First, we press as sewn. From here, you want to get a seam roll or pressing ham, whichever you prefer. You're going to open up the dart. The object here is that when you press, you're going to press the bias strip back on itself and the dart opposite. So you can see that is what it will look like after you press. Next, trimming. When I trim this dart, I like to trim it and make the profile somewhat like the opposite side. You can go a little wider if you need to. But you start, whether at the end or at the top, that's entirely up to you, but you gradually trim it out. So the object of the game here, you have two even thicknesses on either side of this dart so that when you turn it over, you have a flat surface. You don't have a ridge on one side where both of the returns of the dart are. Here I have sewn the darts as balanced darts. So this is the end of this installment. Do your homework, and I will see you next time.